Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. We're really excited about today's topic. We've all been thinking about this as we've kind of gone through our own learning, especially college. What really drives students and how do they take control of their own learning, right?
Yeah.
You guys shared some really fantastic sources, and one that we are really going to dig into today is a conceptual framework for assessing motivation and self-regulated learning in college students.
By Paul Pintrich.
By Paul Pintrich, yes.
Yeah, that's a foundational article in this area.
Yeah.
It really helps us understand all the different ways students can approach their learning, especially in higher ed.
Exactly. And so our mission today is to really unpack all of these resources that you shared and give you a very clear understanding of what self-regulated learning is, SRL, in the college context,
Right.
and how that compares with another perspective called student approaches to learning, or SRL.
Right?
Think of this as your shortcut to understanding how students can really actively construct their learning, monitor their progress, and adapt their strategies.
Yep.
So let's jump right in.
So at the highest level, when we look at how researchers have tried to understand student motivation and learning in college, we've got these two main perspectives that have emerged.
Okay.
And one is this student approaches to learning, or SL perspective.
Okay.
And the other was initially called the information processing approach, or the IP approach. But it's really important to know that that's evolved quite significantly into what we now call the self-regulated learning, or SRL perspective.
Okay, so two different lenses. Where did they come from? What's the difference in their sort of starting points?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the SLL models often emerged from a lot of really rich and detailed conversations with students. So researchers would go out and they would conduct in-depth interviews with students, and really asking students about their experiences, what motivates them, how do they approach studying,
Yeah.
what does their learning process look like in the real world of college. So it's really about understanding learning from the student's point of view.
Okay, got it, got it. So really building the picture from the ground up based on what students are telling us.
Exactly.
Okay. And then the information processing approach, which became SRL.
Yeah. So that traditionally came from kind of a different direction. Uh, Researchers often drawing on established psychological theories of how we think and how we learn, would apply those existing ideas to the college student experience.
Mhm.
And they often use more quantitative research methods to
Mhm.
actually kind of test those theories out in the real world.
Okay, so it sounds like SL is really about listening to the student experience and how they feel about it.
Right.
And the information processing approach, which became SRL, is applying what we already know about human behavior to college students.
Yeah, exactly. And the shift from IP to SRL was a really, really big step forward because the IP model initially was a little bit limited in scope. It was primarily focused on kind of the cognitive aspects, so how students process information. But what's really interesting about SRL is that it really broadened that view quite a bit. So it incorporates not just thinking and memory, but also the really crucial role of motivation, what
Mhm.
drives students, their emotions, and even kind of the social environment in which learning takes place.
Yeah, one of the things that I think people kind of hit on with that old information processing model is that it didn't really address the why. Why are some students more engaged than others? What
Subs-
drives them to do it?
Exactly. And SRL tackles that head on
Yeah.
and gives you a much more comprehensive picture.
Cool. So now that we've kind of set the stage and
Right.
we're looking at SRL being the more complete picture.
Yep.
When we talk about self-regulated learning, what are the core beliefs? What are the assumptions that most of these models, these SRL models share?
Yeah. So there are generally four key assumptions that most SRL models agree on.
Okay.
And the first one is what we call the active constructive assumption.
Okay.
And this is a really, really important one. It's actually one where both SRL and SRL perspectives strongly agree.
Okay.
And the basic idea here is that learners aren't just passive recipients of information. They're not just like empty vessels waiting to be filled.
Right.
They're active participants who are constantly, building their own understanding,
Yeah.
setting their own learning goals, figuring out strategies based on what's happening around them and what's going on in their own minds.
Right. So we're not just sponges. We're not just absorbing. We're actually, making sense of things.
Exactly. Yep. So that's the first assumption, that learning is active and it's constructive. And that's a key takeaway for you listening, is that learning isn't about passively receiving information.
Okay.
It's about actively building your own understanding.
Got it.
The second assumption is what we call the potential for control assumption.
Okay.
And SRL models believe that learners have the capacity to monitor, control, and regulate different aspects of themselves. Their thinking processes, their motivation levels, their behaviors, and even try to influence their learning environment to some extent.
Okay, but not completely.
Right.
Right.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Right.
It's important to be realistic. It's not like students have perfect control all the time in every situation.
Right.
There are obviously limitations based on things like their prior knowledge, the
Mm.
difficulty of the material and just the learning environment itself. But the key insight here is that students can learn to take more control over their learning.
Right. Okay. So we can't just, instantly master a really complex topic by wishing it so.
Exactly, yeah. And this is where it gets really interesting when we compare SRL to SAL,
Okay.
because some SAL models might focus more on this idea of um, relatively stable learning styles.
Okay.
So suggesting that students have preferred ways of learning that might be less easily changed through conscious effort.
Okay.
But other SL models do acknowledge that, the context of learning matters and
Yeah.
that individuals can adapt their approaches to some degree.
Okay, so
Yeah.
a little bit of disagreement there,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
okay. So the second one is SRL kind of puts more strength in the idea that we can influence our learning.
Yep.
What's the third one?
The third one is what we call the goal criterion or standard assumption.
Oh, okay.
And what SRL models are proposing here is that learners typically set some kind of goal, some benchmark, some standard that they're aiming for in their learning. And they actually monitor their progress towards that goal and make adjustments as needed to reach it.
Hmm.
So kind of intuitively, this makes sense. Knowing what you want to achieve helps you figure out how to get there.
Sure. Yeah. It's fundamental.
Yeah.
You've got to have a target to kind of guide you.
Absolutely. And Sala models generally would agree that goals are important in learning.
Hmm.
But in some SL models, there might be a more fixed or direct link assumed between a student's motivation and the specific learning strategies they tend to use. So, for example, it might be suggested that if a student is primarily motivated by external rewards like grades, we call these extrinsic goals, that they'll almost always engage in surface level learning strategies like rote memorization.
Oh, okay. So it's seen as this cause and effect.
Kind of, yeah. And SRL offers a more flexible perspective
Hmm.
where it suggests the students can have a variety of goals and they can actually strategically combine those different types of goals and learning strategies in different ways depending on the situation and the demands of the task.
Okay, so that makes sense. That seems to make more sense with real life because we all have different reasons for wanting to learn something.
Right.
And we kind of adapt our approach. So
Exactly, yep.
what's the fourth assumption?
So the fourth general assumption
Yeah.
is what we call the mediational role assumption.
Okay.
And the idea here is that SRL perspectives see those self-regulatory activities, those active things students do to manage their learning, as the crucial link that connects their personal characteristics, the specific learning context they're in, and their ultimate achievement, or performance.
Right.
It's not just about who you are as a learner or the environment you're in. It's how you actively regulate your learning processes within that context that really makes a difference in the outcome.
Okay, so it's the how of learning that kind of bridges the gap between the who and the where and the what.
Yeah. Exactly. So, to summarize this fourth assumption is that those self-regulatory activities really act as a bridge between, who the student is as a learner, the context in which they're learning, and the outcomes they achieve.
Okay. So just kind of to wrap up these four big assumptions, it sounds like both SRL and SL kind of agree on two of them. One, that learning is an active process and that self-regulatory activities are key.
Right. Yep. Exactly.
But they differ a little bit in the potential of learners to control their learning and how kind of fluid the motivation and the strategies are, or if there's a more rigid structure to that.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a really good summary of the key areas of agreement and potential disagreement.
Cool. So, we talked about how SL models often come from this phenomenological approach while SRL is rooted in psychological theory.
Right.
Can you explain what that difference in origin means in practical terms?
Yeah. So it really boils down to, how each perspective builds its understanding of student learning.
Okay.
So the SL models, with their strong emphasis on student interviews and real-world observations, they tend to derive their core ideas and concepts directly from the student's own experiences and how they describe their learning and studying. So instead of starting with a theory,
Okay.
they're starting with by listening very closely to student experiences and building their ideas from there. So from the phenomena of learning as students see it.
Okay, so they're basically building the picture of learning based on what students are actually telling them about their experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very bottom-up approach.
Bottom up, okay.
Whereas, SRL models tend to take more of a top-down approach,
Yeah.
where they typically begin with these established psychological theories of how we think, how we become motivated, and how learning generally occurs. And then they apply those pre-existing theoretical frameworks to the specific context of college student learning.
Okay, so SL starts with student experience.
Right.
SRL starts with kind of what we know from psychology.
Okay. Exactly.
Okay.
Cool. So now the article goes on to introduce a pretty detailed framework
It does.
for SRL.
Yep.
Can you walk us through the main components of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Table 1 in the article presents a really useful conceptual framework for understanding self-regulated learning. And it's really organized around 2 key dimensions.
Okay.
And these are the phases of self-regulation and the areas where that regulation can occur.
Okay.
So the phases are represented as rows in the table, and they generally represent, the sequence of processes that are involved in self-regulation.
Yeah. And those are planning, monitoring, control, and then reaction or reflection.
Okay.
And these phases aren't unique to this specific framework. You'll see similar stages in lots of models of self-regulation.
So it's kind of like a learning cycle that we go through.
In a broad sense,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah. So you start by planning, then you keep track of how things are going, you make adjustments as needed, and then finally you think back about how the whole process went.
Right.
But it's really important to remember that real learning isn't always this neat step-by-step process.
Right.
These phases can overlap, they can happen in a really dynamic way, and they can even occur simultaneously as a student's working on a task.
Right. Okay. So not such a rigid checklist, but it's more fluid, it's more interactive.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then the other dimension of the framework, so the columns in the table, represent those different areas where students can regulate themselves.
Okay.
And those are the domains of regulation.
Okay.
So there's cognition, your thinking,
Okay.
motivation and effect,
Okay.
your feelings and your drive,
Okay.
behavior, so your actions,
Got it.
and context, your learning environment.
Okay.
So within each of those phases, the planning, the monitoring, the control, and the reflection, a student can be engaging in activities related to managing their thoughts, their emotions, their motivation, their actions, and their surrounding learning environment.
Okay.
So it's really a helpful way to break it down.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, because it highlights that self-regulation isn't just about studying harder.
Right.
It's this really multifaceted process that involves managing all of these different aspects of your learning journey.
Yeah, it's so true. It's really holistic.
Yeah, absolutely. And one key point that the article makes is that regulation isn't like a separate category of strategies itself.
Oh, okay.
It's a process that can be applied across all 4 of these domains.
Okay, so it's not like, okay, I'm going to regulate.
Right.
It's I'm going to regulate my cognitive processes. I'm going to regulate my motivation.
Exactly. Yeah. It's about the process of planning, monitoring, controlling, and reacting within each of those specific areas.
Okay, I like it. It's a good way of looking at it.
Yeah.
So let's kind of dive into each of these areas.
Okay.
And maybe start with regulation of cognition.
Okay.
What does that look like in practice, like for a student?
Yeah. So regulation of cognition is really all about how students plan, track, and actively manage their thinking processes during learning.
Okay.
So in the planning phase, for example, this might involve, setting specific learning goals for a study session, thinking about what they already know about the topic, and considering which study strategies might be most effective for the task that they're facing.
Right.
So, if you're about to read a chapter for a class, planning might involve deciding, what do I want to get out of this reading, and maybe even briefly scanning the headings, to kind of activate what you already know about the subject.
Right. Like setting an intention for the reading.
Yeah, exactly.
And getting your mental gears turning a little bit beforehand.
Exactly. And then there's the monitoring phase, And this is about being aware of your own understanding as you are learning.
Okay.
So this could involve things like constantly checking if you're comprehending the material you're reading, noticing when your attention starts to drift, or assessing your progress in relation to those initial learning goals that you set.
Yeah.
So, those moments when you realize you've been kind of staring at the page, but you haven't actually absorbed anything, that's a breakdown in monitoring.
Yeah. We've all been there for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what happens after that?
Yeah, so then comes the control phase. If you realize through monitoring that you're not understanding or that your focus is wandering, you might decide, I need to change my approach here.
Right.
Um, and this could involve using specific cognitive strategies,
Yeah.
like going back and rereading a difficult section, um, trying to elaborate on the concepts by connecting them to other things you've learned, or organizing the information in a way that makes more sense to you, like, creating a mind map or summarizing key points.
Yeah. Okay. So it's about actively adjusting, when you realize something's not working.
Exactly. Yep.
Now, the article mentions this motivated strategies for learning questionnaire, the MSLQ.
Right.
Um, how does that tool kind of relate to this idea of cognitive regulation?
Yeah, so the MSLQ is a survey that asks students about their use of different learning and study strategies as well as their motivational beliefs.
Mm.
And it includes 5 scales that specifically tap into cognitive regulation.
Okay.
And those are rehearsal, like
Okay.
memorization, elaboration,
Okay.
making connections,
Okay.
organization, structuring information,
Okay.
metacognition, thinking about your own thinking,
Oh,
and
right.
critical thinking.
Okay.
So evaluating information. Um, and these scales primarily capture the monitoring and control aspects of cognitive regulation.
Okay.
So, for example, the metacognition scale asks students about their planning, monitoring, and regulating activities during learning.
Okay.
And critical thinking assesses how much students are actively applying their prior knowledge
Mm.
and analyzing the information they're learning.
Okay, so the MSLQ is a tool that researchers use to actually measure how much students are using these different cognitive
Yeah.
strategies.
Yep. Exactly. But yeah, the article does point out that the MSLQ, while it's a valuable tool and it's been widely used, it doesn't cover all the potential cognitive regulation strategies that the broader SRL framework suggests. There are lots more possibilities beyond those specific 5 scales.
Okay.
Also, the article highlights a potential difference in level of detail. SRL models, like the one that's being presented in this article, tend to identify a larger and more specific set of strategies
Okay.
compared to the more general surface learning versus deep learning distinction that you often find in SL models.
Right.
And then finally, the question of whether these strategies are seen as kind of fixed learning styles
Right.
or something that can change depending on the course or the task.
Right.
So the researchers who developed the MSLQ have always kind of operated under the assumption that students' learning strategies and their motivation can vary quite a bit depending on the specific course that they're taking.
Okay.
And their research findings have generally supported this idea.
Right.
And this kind of raises some interesting questions about whether it's really most effective to measure motivation and self-regulation at this very general university learning level, which is an approach that some SL models take, although not all of them.
Right.
And both perspectives acknowledge that students might even adapt their strategies within a single course, depending on the specific task. But the SRL approach behind the MSLQ has generally focused on the course level as a practical way to gather information through self-report questionnaires.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That makes sense. You probably approach studying for a math exam differently than studying for a literature paper.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's move on to the second area of regulation,
Okay.
motivation and effect.
Okay.
So our feelings and our drive to learn.
Yeah.
How can students manage these internal factors?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is where students are trying to exert control over their motivational beliefs. So things like their goals for the course, their belief in their ability to succeed, what we call self-efficacy,
Okay.
how challenging they perceive the tasks to be, how much they value the subject matter and their personal interest in it. So it's really about managing, your inner drivers and your emotional responses to the learning process.
It's about cultivating a mindset that's conducive to learning.
Exactly, yeah. And students can use a variety of strategies to try to influence these beliefs and emotions. So, for example, if a student is feeling a lack of confidence in their ability to master a difficult concept, they might use positive self-talk,
Mm.
reminding themselves of past successes or focusing on the effort that they're putting in.
Okay.
To increase their motivation, they might promise themselves a small reward after completing a challenging task, or try to find ways to make the material more personally relevant or interesting. Have you ever tried to make you know, studying less of a chore by rewarding yourself afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, a coffee break can be a huge motivator for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then when it comes to managing emotions, students also use different tactics. So to deal with anxiety before a test, for instance,
Right.
they might use relaxation techniques or again engage in that calming self-talk.
Right.
Um, and it's interesting, some students even use negative emotions like shame or guilt to
Wow.
push themselves to study harder.
Yeah.
There's also the phenomenon of defensive pessimism,
Yeah.
where students anticipate the worst case scenario as a way to kind of motivate themselves to work harder to avoid that outcome.
Okay.
And on the flip side, there's self-handicapping,
Right.
like procrastinating until the last minute
Right.
as a way to kind of create an external excuse for potential failure,
Right.
which can paradoxically lower motivation in the long run.
Yeah, it's fascinating how we use, such a range of psychological strategies, both good and bad,
Right.
to try and manage our motivation and our emotions about learning.
It is, and after completing a learning task, students are often going to experience these emotional reactions, satisfaction with success, disappointment with failure,
Right.
and they'll naturally try to understand the reasons behind those outcomes, what we call attributions.
Okay.
And the types of attributions a student makes can then, have this significant impact on their motivation and emotions in future learning situations.
Okay. So how does the MSLQ kind of measure these aspects of motivation and effect?
Yeah. So the original MSLQ primarily focused on assessing students' motivational beliefs.
Okay.
So things like whether they're driven by intrinsic interest or external rewards,
Okay.
whether they're focused on mastering the material or just performing well. Their level of self-efficacy and their belief that they have control over their own learning. And it also includes a scale to measure test anxiety.
Okay.
But it's important to note that unlike those cognitive scales, the current version of the MSLQ doesn't have specific scales that directly measure the strategies that students use to actively control or regulate their motivation or their emotions.
Okay, so it gives us a picture of their motivational state, but
Right.
not necessarily how they're actively influencing it.
Exactly. And also the article highlights, a key difference when comparing to most SL models is this relative lack of emphasis on constructs like self-efficacy, or general expectancy of success.
Oh, okay.
And this is seen as a potentially important gap, given how strongly research has linked self-efficacy to both academic performance and self-regulation.
Yeah.
So it seems like, believing in your ability to succeed is a pretty fundamental part of actually putting in the effort and persisting through challenges.
Right. Yeah, it really
Yeah.
is. Yeah. So SRL gives us a more detailed look at,
Mhm.
at motivational beliefs and
Right.
and stresses this idea of self-efficacy.
Yeah.
While both perspectives, I think, could benefit from a greater focus on how students are actually,
Right.
regulating their motivation and their emotions.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely.
So let's go to the third area now, regulation of behavior.
Okay.
What is that? What does that involve?
So behavioral regulation is all about students controlling their overt actions
Yeah.
that are directly related to their learning.
Okay.
And a key aspect here is the planning and the management of their time and effort.
Right.
So this includes things like, setting aside specific times for studying, creating study schedules, making decisions about how much effort to allocate to different tasks. Effort control itself is about students' ability to persist and maintain their focus and effort, even when they're faced with difficult or uninteresting material.
The classic struggle. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Have you ever found yourself kind of having to push through a particularly dry textbook chapter?
Yeah, that's the struggle against
Yeah,
distractions and procrastination.
exactly. Yeah. And another really crucial behavioral strategy is help seeking.
Okay.
Knowing when you are struggling
Okay.
and then taking the initiative to ask for assistance from, instructors, TAs, or even peers.
Right.
And while this is, an action on the part of the student, it also ties into this idea of regulating their learning context
Okay.
by actively seeking out and utilizing resources in their environment.
So it's not just about sitting alone and studying.
Right.
It's about being strategic in how you get the help that you need.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's about managing your time, your
Exactly.
effort,
Yeah.
and knowing when to ask for help.
Absolutely. And the MSLQ does include scales that relate to behavioral regulation. So there's a scale for effort regulation, which asks students about their tendency to persevere when faced with academic difficulties.
Okay.
There's also a scale for time and steady environment management, which looks at how effectively they organize their study time
Hmm.
and create this physical learning space that's conducive to concentration.
Right.
And then finally, there's a scale on help seeking.
Okay, cool. So the MSLQ actually gives us some insight into these actions that students are taking.
It does. Yeah, it
Yeah.
does. And it's interesting. The article points out that SL models generally don't have these types of specific behavioral regulation scales, although there might be some overlap in concepts.
Okay.
But the article suggests that there's no strong theoretical reason why these types of behavioral regulation strategies couldn't be incorporated into the SL perspective as well.
Yeah.
I mean, the ability to effectively manage your time, is sustain effort and know when to seek help are clearly critical self-regulatory skills for success in college.
Yeah,
Yeah.
especially with the increased independence,
Right.
and responsibility that comes with higher ed.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. Well, let's talk about the fourth and final area now, which is regulation of context.
Okay.
The learning environment itself.
Right. Yeah. So this involves students' conscious attempts to control and shape the learning tasks and the overall learning environment that they're in.
Okay.
And compared to regulating your own thoughts or your motivation,
Yeah.
influencing the context can sometimes be more challenging because it's not always directly under the learner's immediate control.
Right. Right. Like in a very structured classroom, the instructor is the one